This is a Sports Catastrophe special presentation. Hey there, Heather Ho there. It's Jeff Gaudreaus. Welcome you to a very special Sports Catastrophe video. It is August 31st, 2024, and I don't have a on this day moment for August 31st that I haven't covered in the past 3 years. But it gives me a perfect, ample opportunity to replace what could have been an on this day with a very special video. Unfortunately, it's been a tragic 24 hours in hockey land, as Johnny Gaudreaus, or Johnny Hockey, as he was referred to by many people, passed away from injuries in an accident in which a drunk driver slammed into Johnny's bike and his brother Matthew's bike, killing them both at the scene. It's a huge loss because Johnny Gaudreaus is not only an NHL player, but he was a current NHL player when he got struck. Many times you don't see current NHL players go down for any reason whatsoever. And this is the first time in practically 13 years that an active NHLer of Johnny Gaudreaus' star quality passed away. I know there are several players who played in the NHL or prospects who died, including that Columbus goalie that died in the fireworks accident in 2021. But there are some stars that suffered through a massive death and all that. And we will be covering 20 of these instances. And no, they will not be ranked. I was originally going to rank them based off of the player and the massive death thing, but it just wouldn't be right. So here is the 20 players who were actively NHLers and all that. I did cheat for a few, but for good reason. The first main player to die was Bad Joe Hall in 1919. Now, in 1919, ironically, like 2020, had a massive worldwide epidemic that shut down a lot of life-altering events. In 1919, it was the Spanish influenza that ruined people worldwide and contributed to about 1 million deaths. And this is 1919, mind you. The world was less populous than it is now in 2020. So anyway, during the Stanley Cup playoffs, the finals, the Montreal Canadiens would take on the Seattle Metropolitans. Now, of course, things were different in the Stanley Cup. It was more of a challenge cup. And the fact that the NHL's champions would face the Pacific Coast Hockey champions for the Stanley Cup was huge because there was a possibility that an NHL team would not win the Stanley Cup. But in 1919, Montreal and Seattle would face each other. All the games would be played in Seattle, the best of 5. Unfortunately, though, the Spanish influenza hit both teams, especially the Canadiens, very hard, as team manager George Kennedy and famed defenseman Bad Joe Hall were victimized by both dying influenza. And remember, medical advancements are key because they weren't as big in 1919 as they are now in 2020. Well, 2024. But the fact of the matter is, Bad Joe Hall would end up dying in a Seattle hospital. In fact, both the Canadiens and Metropolitans were playing hot potato with giving each other maybe the Stanley Cup, especially Montreal. They figured they had to forfeit to Seattle. But Seattle refused to take that and said that it wouldn't be fair. So with 5 games done, Montreal and Seattle both won twice with a tie. So it was decided that the Stanley Cup would not be awarded to any of the teams. And before 2005, that was the only time in Stanley Cup history that the Stanley Cup was not awarded in a year. So that was one of the first major deaths of all time. Another major star to die as an active NHLer was George Vezina. Yes, the guy responsible for being on the name of the greatest trophy for a hockey goalie to get. Best goalie in the NHL would get the Vezina Award. That was awarded after his death, 1926. But the fact of the matter is that George Vezina was a great goalie. he was an NHL star, and he helped Montreal out with a few Stanley Cups. Vezina was seen playing for Chicoutimi with their senior team, playing the Montreal Canadiens franchise. And he wore rubber boots instead of skates. And yet he was so good in nets that the Habs signed him right away. And he played 16 years with the Habs, bringing them a couple of Stanley Cups and bringing pride and joy to the province of Quebec. Unfortunately, though, in 1925, he lost a substantial amount of weight before the first game of the season when the Habs were hosting the Pittsburgh Pirates. Yeah, Pittsburgh and an NHL team in the 1920s. But the fact of the matter is that George Vezina would collapse after the first period and would be diagnosed with having tuberculosis, or TB for short. TB unfortunately would claim him as he had to go to a sanitarium and all that. And George Vezina died in the 1925 season. It was one of the saddest moments in Habs history. It wouldn't be the saddest in a sense, because later on they would also get bit. The next major tragedy didn't involve the Habs. It involved the Blackhawks, as Charlie Gardner was the star goalie for the Blackhawks. Coming over from Scotland, he was a Winnipeg senior hockey legend and then signed with the Blackhawks. Chicago kind of had the rights to the Prairies players as trying to build them up, because remember, this is before the draft system. So anyway, what ended up happening was that Charlie Gardner was good for the Blackhawks. The 1934 Hawks were a decent bunch, winning the American Division and then winning a trip to the final to take on the pesky Detroit Red Wings. But unfortunately, Charlie Gardner picked up a pair of shutouts during the final and helped the Blackhawks win the 1934 Stanley Cup, their first in franchise history. Unfortunately, though, Gardner would soon die of a brain hemorrhage, mostly caused by the fact that he had tonsillitis and a headache and fever and all that, and he just basically brushed it off. Unfortunately, though, everything overwhelmed the system and he died of the problems. So for the one of trying to hide tonsillitis and then it spread to his body, it can do that, and it did to Charlie Gardner. Well, when I talked about George Vezina, I said that Montreal, this wouldn't be the saddest Montreal Canadian death of all time. And that is true. So Howie Morenz in 1924 was signed by the Habs from Stratford, a senior team. Morenz was not playing well with the Habs and practically decided to give back all the money to Montreal management and just go back to Stratford. However, the Canadiens used the team to try to convince Morenz to stay, and also the fact that they were going to out Morenz for accepting $800 in money, because he was supposed to be an amateur. He was not supposed to be paid for it. So with that combination, Morenz stayed with the Habs and was the first megastar on offense. Of course, this was in a league that didn't really have forward passing, and you couldn't pass in every zone. Imagine what Morenz would have been like if passing was more open in the 1920s and 30s. A couple of trades later, he was back with Montreal in 1937, and then Earl Siebert of the Detroit Red Wings managed to injure Morenz in a terrible way. Morenz had got his skate caught in the wooden boards. Boards were different back in the 1930s. Unfortunately, Earl Siebert in his 200-plus pound frame smashed into Morenz's leg, cracking it. Morenz kind of had a feeling that he was done with hockey, and unfortunately he would die of a heart embolism. Some say that basically the stress of him never playing in the NHL got to him and he died of a broken heart, but that remains to be seen. So after Howie Morenz's death and the whole macabre thing, March 11th, 1937, which ended up being the saddest day in Montreal history, March 11th, because in 1996 the Forum would close and move to the Bell Center. And also, Bernie Boom Boom Geoffrion died on March 11th, just hours before he was going to be honored with his number 5 being retired by the Habs. The next major NHL star to die was Bill Baruchel in 1951. Everyone knows about the tragically hip song Bill Baruchel Disappeared. That's ever. He was on a fishing trip. The last goal he ever scored won the Leafs the cup. Blah, blah, blah. 50 Mission Cap, good song. Now, Bill Baruchel was a pretty good defenseman. He actually played in the Pacific Coast League when it was a minor league club and played for Hollywood Wolves. Hollywood had a hockey team? But the fact of the matter was that Baruchel was signed by the Leafs, and he was a pretty good stay-home defenseman. Baruchel was supposed to be a stay-home defenseman, like not really play offensively. However, he couldn't resist, and in Game 5 of the 1951 Stanley Cup Finals, he rushed in, scored the goal over Jerry McNeil's shoulder, and helped the Habs lose the Stanley Cup to the Leafs in 5 games. The Leafs were happy and all that. All was forgiven with Baruchel being up on the play, as management did forgive him. But unfortunately, in the offseason, he and a friend, Henry Hudson, decided to board a plane to go to Northern Ontario to fish. Unfortunately, a combination of bad airplane stuff and the fact that there were tons of fish and it added to the weight of the plane made the plane crash into northern brush. They employed the biggest air search in Canada at the time after Baruchel was found missing. It didn't take till late in 1962, a few months after the Leafs won the Stanley Cup for the first time in 11 years, that they found Baruchel's body and the damaged plane, which was kind of eerie and all that, because when Baruchel had disappeared, the Leafs could not win the Cup, but they won the Cup in 62. And then months later, they found Baruchel. So that was just huge. Next in the list of massive deaths was in 1968. And the reason why, there's a trophy named after this guy. So Bill Masterton was a pretty good player. He was a star player in the United States with the hockey there, and he was pretty good. He was a Habs prospect. The only problem was that this was during the original 6 era, where there were only 6 teams, and getting on to a team was easier said than done. It's not like the NHL nowadays, where there's 32 teams and plenty of spots open. The NHL had only 6 teams and about 20 spots. So practically, if you weren't in the top 120 spots, you were dead duck and doomed to play minor league hockey forever. Masterton actually was a good hockey player and then decided to retire to work for Honeywell Corporation, trying to help with the moon landing and all that. He was persuaded out of retirement by the Minnesota North Stars, who had his rights from the Habs organization. So the North Stars, being one of the new franchises, knew Masterton could help, and Masterton did. Unfortunately, in January 1968, Masterton was hit hard, body checked by 2 Oakland players, Larry Cahan and Ron Harris, and fell backwards onto the ice, and you could hear the crack when his head hit the ice. Masterton was alive for a while, but then died of his injuries a few days later. Cahan and Harris both were racked with guilt and all that. Cahan would never talk about it, but Harris did give an interview in 2003 to the St. Paul Pioneer Press, saying he regretted it and all that. This injury actually brought the NHL to thinking players need to wear helmets to protect themselves. Yeah, they were crude compared to the helmets of 2024, but many players decided to don a helmet for their safety and all that. Fortunately, though, this is the only time an active NHLer has died during a game and all that, despite the NHL waiting until 1979 to mandate helmets. Yeah, and the Masterton Trophy named for the player who showed integrity and all that to come back from hockey problems. And then you got yourself in 1970 a pair of tragedies of epic proportions. First off was Terry Sawchuk, who was a legendary goalie who played for the Red Wings and helped them win many cups in the early 50s. However, Sawchuk suffered from emotional problems and all that, And after being traded from the Red Wings to Boston, in his first year with the Bruins, he actually lost the passion, and for 2 months he retired, but he came back to the NHL. He had a few decent runs. He went from Boston back to Detroit, was the Stanley Cup, the goalie in the 60s for the Red Wings, and then got sent to Toronto in what they call the intra-league draft, that you could draft from other teams, and Detroit unprotected Sawchuk, and the Leafs snapped him up, which was shocking because, why would you want Sawchuk when you had Bauer? So anyway, Toronto had the goalie tandem of Sawchuk and Bauer for a few years. And it paid off in 1967 as that duo helped the Leafs win the Stanley Cup. He was left unprotected in the expansion draft, and LA snatched him up. So he played a few years with LA. Then he went back to Detroit, and then was snapped up by the New York Rangers. And that was wild with the Rangers when he died. So he finished the 1970 season, and then he got in an argument with Ron Stewart, fellow teammate, about some bills and all that. Unfortunately, though, Stewart tackled Sawchuk, and Sawchuk's abdominal area hit a barbecue grill and punctured it. So he had a ruptured spleen, which was removed. Unfortunately, though, they couldn't do much with his health care, and sadly, though Sawchuk had died, he did not declare his retirement, so thus he was an active NHLer when this happened. Ron Stewart was racked with guilt over the incident, but thankfully, though, he was acquitted of any problems. So yeah, it was hard to believe that one of the greatest goalies of all time died in a senseless accident. However, that, as I said, that wasn't the first major thing of 1970. The next thing was a Pittsburgh Penguin icon by the name of Michel Briere. He was a pretty good player for the Penguins and a young prospect. However, he ended up being in a car crash and then died months later of his injuries. Michel Briere was a special player for Pittsburgh, especially in the early years of their franchise. He was practically Pittsburgh's star player in the era before Lemieux and before Crosby. Briere would actually have the Quebec Major League Junior Hockey League MVP be named after him. And also, Pittsburgh retired as number 21 and all that. So that was major. Then it comes to another major star. Former star of the Leafs for 2 decades. And then he went to Buffalo. It was like shocking how Tim Horton was a legend with the Leafs, and then he went to another team. But anyway, Horton was the rock of the Leafs defense and played in the 50s, 60s, and even 1970 with the team. It was unfathomable to have a Leafs team without Tim Horton while he was active. Horton parlayed things into 4 years of playing with the Buffalo Sabres. However, he was winding down his career practically in 1874 when the Sabres faced the Leafs in a game at Maple Leaf Gardens. Horton was named the 3rd star and then left in his major sports car to beat traffic and go down the QEW back to Buffalo. Unfortunately, though, he would crash in St. Catharines and die in a high-speed accident. The hockey world was shocked that Tim Horton would die and all that. And unfortunately, he died because of a speedy car and all that. And Horton, I think, was drinking at that time, too. So practically, Tim Horton was an icon, and he just died while being active. This next player would not be completely well known in NHL circles, but he was an active NHLer when he died. He was the heart and soul of the Blues defense for 4 seasons in the 70s, but Bob Gassoff was a very decent defenseman for the Blues. He would die in a motorcycle accident in the offseason of 1977, pretty much not wearing a helmet when he was on the motorcycle. The Blues would honor Gassoff by retiring his number 3. And a lot of people question if his number should have been retired, but it is what it is. And then next on the list was Wayne Mackey. Wayne Mackey was known for being in that six-string duo with Ted Green. Well, Mackey was a member of the Blues and Ted Green was a member of the Bruins in a preseason game in 1969. It brought violence to the forefront of why it was in hockey and all of that. Mackey would hit Green so hard that Green had brain damage and all that and had to miss the 1970 Bruins season. But he came back for a few years and won a Stanley Cup ring in 1972. But anyway, Wayne Mackey would soon move on to the Vancouver Canucks and become a decent player for the Canucks, wearing number 11. Made good. Unfortunately, though, Mackey would have brain cancer and it claimed his life in 1974. It was a huge moment and all that. Of course, Mackey would be part of controversy when Mark Messier was sent from the Rangers to the Canucks. He wanted to wear number 11, which was sacrilege because the number 11 was retired by the Canucks in a sense. But Mackey's family did allow Messier to wear number 11, and Messier was chastised for it through his 3 seasons with the Canucks. And once Messier went back to the New York Rangers in 2000, the Canucks would retire number 11 again. And then there weren't any major NHLers dead till 1985 when Pelle Lindbergh went down. Pelle Lindbergh was a goalie for the Flyers, and he was going up and down and all that. Like, he would have a few good seasons and a few terrible seasons. But in 1985, he helped the Flyers get to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Oilers. But the Oilers basically twisted Pelle like a pretzel knot. So Pelle played for the Flyers and was their star goalie. But after a team function at a bar in Stanton, New Jersey, at Voorhees Township, if memory serves me right, Lindbergh got into his Porsche 930 Turbo behind the wheel and drove off. Unfortunately, Pelle Lindbergh had 3 times the legal alcohol limit in New Jersey and crashed into a retaining wall by a school, dying on impact. The Flyers just couldn't understand what would happen to all that. Strangely enough, the fans would vote Pelle Lindbergh in as starting goalie for the Wales Conference in the 1986 All-Star Game. Of course, Pelle Lindbergh's dead. But the fact of the matter was that Pelle Lindbergh's death was huge, and a lot of people were blamed for allowing Lindbergh to get behind the wheel of the car in the first place. The fact of the matter was that Pelle Lindbergh was an icon for the Flyers. Yes, they got lucky with Ron Hextall being the star goalie and all that, but it should never have came to this. And then the next major active NHLer who died was John Kordic. Now, Kordic's career would be basically that of a goon, an enforcer, a guy who just liked to fight. He wasn't good offensively. He had his moments, but he was known for being a pug and all that. He was once a Hab, and then in 1988 he was traded to the Leafs, and the Leafs gave up Ross Courtnall in that deal, which was stupid because Ross Courtnall became a very serviceable member of the Habs and of the Dallas Stars. Kordic would ruffle feathers by wearing number 27 for the Leafs, which of course was the famous number that Frank Mahovlich and Darryl Sittler both wore. But the Leafs had a policy of not retiring uniform numbers and all that. It wouldn't take till 1992 for the Leafs to retire numbers, when they retired Bill Brickell's number 5 and Ace Bailey's number 6. But John Kordic played for the Leafs for a few years and then shuffled around until he got to the Quebec Nordiques. And, well, still an active member of the Nordiques organization, he died of a drug overdose in a Quebec City motel. And it was just amazing. His death was just shrouded in controversy and all that. So next on the list was Steve Chiasson of the Carolina Hurricanes, who was still with the Canes as a mentoring defenseman, if you will. Chiasson would spend a lot of his career with the Detroit Red Wings, and then move on to Carolina. Well, Hartford/Carolina. So he's playing for that. And days after the Canes were eliminated by Boston in the Stanley Cup playoffs, the Canes had a team party. Unfortunately, though, Jason left early and then, while intoxicated, would get into his pickup truck, and unfortunately, he would crash. Carolina did not retire his number 3, contrary to popular belief, but no. Jason's death was just tragic, and, a drunk driver getting behind the wheel and crashing and killing himself as an active NHLer. It was huge. It was just like Pally Lindbergh, and Tim Horton even. But the fact of the matter is that Carolina still missed Steve Chiasson. And then another car crash claimed somebody else. Dan Snyder was a Atlanta Thrashers prospect, the man from Elmira, Ontario. He was decent for the Thrashers because, the Thrashers were not really that great of a team. So anyway, in September 2003, he and teammate Danny Heatley were driving when Danny Heatley had, in a huge moment of speed, would actually crash into a retaining wall, injuring him and Snyder. But Snyder, in the passenger seat, was hit more critically and all that. Heatley got off with some minor injuries, but unfortunately Snyder would die of his accident and all that. A lot of people were upset with Danny Heatley and all that, and thought Heatley should have gotten criminally charged. Heatley probably would have spent some time behind bars, but the fact of the matter is that the Snyder family came out and said that they forgave Danny Heatley and all that. Their statement was huge because it prevented Heatley from going to jail. Well, I think he did go to jail for a while. But the fact of the matter is that Heatley still got to pick up his career and play after 2003 and all that. Although it would never be the same. He did have flashes of brilliance with the Ottawa Senators. But Dan Snyder's death would haunt him, and he started to play terribly. Not only that, it caused a major thing because Danny Heatley was the cover boy for NHL 2004. Unfortunately, because of what happened, Heatley's face was taken off the cover, and new NHL 2004 games would have Marcus Naslund on the front cover. Oh, sorry, Joe Sakic on the cover of NHL 2004 after Danny Heatley's thing. So that's just hard to believe. Well, next is a guy who died in Latvia. He wasn't with the NHL at the time, but his death was just shocking, all that. Sergei Sholtok was a serviceable player for both the Habs and the Wild and all that. So he was playing in Latvia when he collapsed on the ice during a game and died. It was just huge because Latvia didn't really have many star players except for Artur Zerbe coming out of the former Soviet Republic. And then, Sholtok died and all that. A honorable mention goes to Alexei Sharpanov because he was a Ranger prospect who definitely would have been part of the Rangers in 2008 and beyond. But he died of a heart problem. And unfortunately, the arena did not have a defibrillator, which could have saved his life. So that was just a cautionary tale. And then you got yourself Luc Bourdon, who was a Canucks prospect who was pretty good winning the 2006 World Juniors while playing in the same arena where he would be a Canuck one day. And he did play a few games for the Canucks. Unfortunately, though, in the offseason of 2007, he was involved in a motorcycle accident in which he had lost control of his bike and crashed into another car. Bourdon, I don't know if he wore a helmet. I don't think he did. But anyway, he died on impact. And the Canucks were just crestfallen because he was definitely going to be a member of the Canucks defense squad in 07-08. Of course, Bourdon was actually mentioned by a YouTube Redditor 3 years later because when the Canucks beat the Sharks in that strange goal that iced them the 2011 conference finals, which got them to the final against Boston, someone had said that it was the ghost of Luc Bourdon that made sure the puck hit that stanchion and did not go over the glass. And then that was when they noticed the puck and slapped it into the net to win Game 5. That's the Sharks. The next one is a triple entry, but it was just a bad summer in 2011. This was, of course, the craziest summer of NHL players' deaths until, of course, yesterday. But the fact of the matter was that there was a trend in 2011 that saw 3 well-known bruising players, or goons as some people call them, die within months of each other. Wade Belak was the first to go, former Leaf and Predator. He was a fan favorite with the Leafs and even scored a weird goal, which people laughed at, like at. Anyway, Wade Belak would die first. And then in May 2011, Derek Boogaard, who actually had a hockey school in the off season, well, to teach people how to fight, controversially, was a goon for the Minnesota Wild, and then he signed a crazy 5-year deal with the New York Rangers, and it was like, how do you give this guy a multi-year deal like that? Boogaard would score 1 goal with the Rangers, but then he would die in the off season due to drug problems in 2011, and that wasn't the end of it, as Rick Rippon, who played for the Canucks, also died late in 2011, and people were just shocked at how 3 enforcers would die like that. And was it CTE? Was it something else? So yeah, it was weird to see those people die and all that. I'm going to cheat a little bit because I know that this incident didn't really have any active NHLers in it. But yeah, the 2011 locomotive accident was huge because it had several former NHL stars and soon to be NHL stars, if you will. But of course, 4 come to mind, as Ruslan Soleil was a bruising defenseman for the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, coming from Belarus, and he went to the Russian League. Carlos Krakens once had the record for most consecutive games played by an NHL defenseman, while doing it with Nashville, Colorado, and a Latvian. Josef Vasicek from the Czech Republic was a serviceable player for Carolina and a few other teams in the NHL at the time. And Pavel Demitra, the biggest one of that, Slovakian icon, who was great for St. Louis, Minnesota, and a few other teams in the NHL. And in 2010, almost single-handedly helped Slovakia win the Olympic hockey tournament. Slovakia was tying with Canada in the semifinal, but Dimitra hit the post and all that. But yeah, it was huge. It was just shocking for the NHL fraternity to lose so many former players and all that. I know that Alex Kropotsev and Brad McCrimmon also were former NHLers, but yeah, it was just hard to handle. And of course, we end this video with the guy who has inspired this special Sports Catastrophe. Yeah, Johnny Hockey, Johnny Gaudreaus. Star player from the state of New Jersey, played at Boston College in his collegiate career after Calgary drafted him in 2011. Spent 4 years with the Eagles, won the national title as a freshman, and then a few years later, he was the Hobey Baker Award winner as the college hockey's best player. He would then sign with Calgary, have a few decent seasons with the Flames. And then he had a breakout year in 2022, scoring 115 points and being second in the scoring race. Despite all that, that was in his contract year. And that meant that, he was a free agent. Calgary did whatever they could. New Jersey tried to sign him. The Islanders tried to sign him. But he decided to go to Columbus. Of all places, it was Columbus. Not a lot of people wanted to go to Columbus as a free agent, but he did. So he spent 2 years with the Blue Jackets doing serviceable. And then, he was taken from us much too soon. And fans in Calgary and Columbus are really, in deep mourning, and that's the truth. So anyway, thanks for watching this special presentation. I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.